For that introduction. Right. Okay, I'm going to press continue, and I'm going to go on screen share now, which is here. And I will do I think full screen, hopefully. Yes, can everyone see that on the screen? Great, okay, thanks. Okay, well, I will go get started. I don't need to do an introduction. Mark's given me a lovely introduction. And I am making some assumptions about what people know about the Holocaust, certain information. When I give talks in schools, I explain a little more about certain names and things. I don't make so many assumptions. So if there is anything that I talk about that you're not aware of, or you don't quite know what I'm talking about, please either ask in the chat or at the end. So I'll start now. Thank you very much for coming, by the way. I feel very privileged to be talking to you on this day, Holocaust Memorial Day. This is my Uncle Moritz, and this is my Aunt Relly, his wife. This is the book that I've written about my search for Relly, because as Mark said, I grew up not knowing that my father was Jewish. This is their wedding photograph, and this is their wedding photograph taken in the Czech town of Moravska Ostrava in 1937. Relly would have been 22 at this time. Now, I never met my Uncle Moritz. This is my father's brother, Moritz, and I didn't meet Relly until the year 2000. I Relly didn't even know I existed. And this is when I did meet Relly. This is more or less what she looked like. She was living in Australia. I made my first of 5 visits to her between the year 2000 and 2010. My first visit was in the year 2000. Now, back to the wedding photograph. Why did I never meet my Uncle Moritz? And why didn't I meet Relly until so late? And why didn't Relly even know I existed? Well, Relly's family, her entire family, and most of her extended family were victims of the Holocaust. Moritz didn't survive either. And I didn't know this because my father, Robert Schonfeld, as Mark said, had concealed the fact that he was Jewish. Both my parents, of course, concealed this fact. I knew about my father's family. I knew they had been killed in the Holocaust, but it was explained differently because a lot of other people got killed in the Holocaust as well. But out of a sense of protection, they decided not to tell the children that he was Jewish. That fear sort of stayed with my mother really all her life, actually. She said to me once, I wouldn't spread that around. If I were you, you never know when something like that will happen again. My father was a lovely man. I have to say, I had a very happy childhood, but he couldn't talk about his family. It was too painful. What I knew about his family was relayed by my mother from the stories he told her during the war. He was a refugee to this country. He got here in 1939. The rest of his family, most of the rest of his family didn't escape. And he went back to Czechoslovakia at the end of the war, hoping to find his family alive and well. And sadly, that wasn't the case. But to go back to Moravska Ostrava, where the wedding photograph was taken, this is a town today, look, apart from the phone booths, looking very much now like it did then. It was a thriving town. This is where my father grew up. This is where Relly spent a lot of time. She grew up in a little village just outside Ostrava, but she came to Moravska Ostrava, which was a district of Ostrava, for cultural activities. She was in a choir there. It was in the choir that she met my father's sister, Moritz's sister, Mari. And through Mari, of course, she met Moritz. And they 1930s, and everything was going well. They hadn't been that affected by the events in Germany yet. Like I say, they got married in 1937. Well, Hitler had been elected in Germany in 1933, but things were okay. And Ostrava, like I say, was a thriving town. I'll explain more about Ostrava shortly. But just to give a map, just give an idea of the map of Europe, of the Jewish populations of Europe, there's Czechoslovakia, of course, and this was the population, Jewish population in 1933, and 2/3 were gone by 1945. So, as everybody knows, the plan was to wipe out the entire Jewish population of Europe. They didn't manage that completely, but they did get rid of 2/3 of the entire population. I think, sorry, some of it is obscured by the pictures, but anyway. And like I say, Czechoslovakia is there, as it was then. It's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And how did they get rid of people? How do they get rid of Jews? Well, I mean, you all know about concentration camps and extermination camps. And you can see there's Auschwitz, the most famous of them all, I think. Treblinka, that's where my grandmother ended up. Where she was killed there. There were death camps and concentration camps, and Theresienstadt was a transit concentration camp used by propaganda for the Nazis as well. And Theresienstadt, my uncle Moritz and Relly actually spent 2.5 years in Theresienstadt. So forgive me if some of this is probably knowledge you all know. This is a mixture of what I present to schools as well. So I'm sure I'm covering ground that you already know. Now, really, there is Theresienstadt. There was Ostrava was about there. There it is. And that was the regions of Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, which formed Czechoslovakia. And Relly grew up in a little village called Jestebnik, which is just outside Ostrava there. It's 19 kilometers away, as you can see. And it was very easy to get to Ostrava by train. Like I say, that's where she spent a lot of her time, got her cultural fix, so to speak. I haven't been able to find a picture of Jestebnik, but this is a picture of, and I've been there, this is a picture of typical Czech countryside. It looks a little like this. And that's where Relly grew up. Her parents were her family was one of 3 Jewish families in the village. They owned a shop. They developed the shop to eventually incorporate a bakery, and everything was going along very well. Like I say, she used to get to Ostrava very quickly by train. There is the train today from Jestebnik, the train station, I should say, looking much the same as it did then. It was built in 1887. Again, just to remind you of the geography, there's Ostrava and there's Jestebnik. Now, Moravska Ostrava, which is where my father grew up as well, and Relly, this is what it looked like in about 1934. And there it is again, a thriving town. Why was it thriving? It was a magnet, really, for immigrants, migrants. It had it had mines. They were mining coal, and there was a huge demand for coal. I'll just go here, in coal and steel at the beginning of the 20th century. This is Vitkovica here. That's another region of Ostrava. And there were mines there, and it drew migrants. Moritz worked in a hospital here as a doctor, treating miners mainly for the lung problems they developed from working in the mines. It was almost a little like, I mean, this is a gross exaggeration, but a little like New York in its appeal to migrants at that period, sort of at the beginning of the 20th century, because there were lots of opportunities. People, all sorts of ethnic groups came, as well as Jews as well. In 1911, the population of Ostrava was 190,000. Now, 10% of that population was Jewish. It was a huge proportion of the society. My grandmother went there, took her young family there, and set up a small fish canning factory in Ostrava as well. There were just so many opportunities for everybody. in particular Jewish people. And it's important to know at this point just a little bit of history. Again, I think probably many of you know this, but Czechoslovakia didn't exist until 1918. A few other countries in Europe also didn't exist then. After the collapse, after the end of the First World War in 1918, which Germany lost, Europe was carved up differently. Until that point, it had been all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there's what became Czechoslovakia there. But Germany lost the war, and it lost a lot of its territories, including its colonies in Africa. And there's a picture of the thriving town again. But here you go with Czechoslovakia, and this area here surrounding it is part of Czechoslovakia. It was known as the Sudetenland because this was one of the territories that had belonged to Germany until 1918, when the Versailles Treaty declared it, gave it to the new nation state of Czechoslovakia. There were several new nation states around that time, but this had belonged to Germany and it was given to Czechoslovakia. So it had a very, very large German population. And everything was fine. Like I say, Hitler had, well, it was fine in Czechoslovakia. It certainly wasn't fine in Germany, but Hitler had been democratically elected in 1933. It didn't take him long to become a dictator. And he decided he wanted this back. He wanted the Sudetenland back because it had large German population. And he got it back, promising that that's all he wanted. In 1938, there's Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, who was keen to avoid another world war, but also he believed Hitler. Hitler said, "Look, won't take anything else. I only want the Sudetenland because of all the Germans there. I won't go after Czechoslovakia or anyone else." And so Chamberlain made a deal with Hitler, and this is a very famous photograph of his waving the Peace for Our Time agreement, which he'd signed with Hitler. And he described the issue of the Sudetenland as a quarrel between people in a faraway country about whom we know nothing. So he was quite happy. I know there are different theories as to what Chamberlain was doing, but whatever his motives were, what he did was kind of sell Czechoslovakia down the river, sacrifice Czechoslovakia at that time. So it was very sudden, the changes that happened. Now he came back to a hero's welcome in England, Chamberlain did. Remember, there was a lot of support for Hitler here as well, and much of the aristocracy were friends or fans of Hitler as well. And of course, this country had its own blatant anti-Semitism. And this is an article from a clipping from the Daily Mail in 1938, with the Daily Mail, which is still owned by the same family now as then. And, saying here, the way stateless Jews from Germany are pouring in from every port of this country is becoming an outrage. Now, this was a lie. This was propaganda and a lie because, my father got into this country. He was a civil engineer. They needed his skills during the war. He spent the war going around the country building airstrips for the RAF. Moritz was a doctor. The British Medical Association did not allow refugee doctors to practice in this country. Morris could not get a job. He couldn't get in, and he was murdered. So to get into this country at that time, you needed a visa, you needed you needed a visa, you needed a job and or a sponsor and or pots of money. So they were not pouring in from every port at that time. And in fact, I'm going to play you a clip now from Relly's testimonial. It wasn't part of the one that Steven Spielberg did, the program. This was an Australian program. I'm afraid the sound quality is not very good, but there are subtitles. So this is really describing how they felt when the Germans invaded the Sudetenland.
Already suspected that eventually Hitler might occupy the whole Czechoslovakia, or
when they took the Sudeten, we were not sure, because Hitler promised he will not take anything more. He wanted only the part where Germans were living, but it wasn't. We saw them that it wasn't true. He made even a pact with the English Halifax, Chamberlain it was, yes, that he will not attack Germany or Czechoslovakia, but it was not true.
So with powerful people like Hitler, like Chamberlain, saying nothing more was going to happen, it's understandable that, you know, a lot of people like Relly just weren't sure what was going to happen. And this is a picture of Germans entering a Sudeten village in 1939. However, not everyone was happy, as you can see from this picture. For people like my father's family, for Jews, for Relly, anyone opposed to the Nazis as well, this was the beginning of a catastrophe. My father, as I said, managed to escape, and at the commemoration this morning at the cathedral, I actually told a story about this passport, because some Czechs, I mean, Relly said no one knew what was going to happen. Many Czechs thought it's going to get worse and tried to get out. And my father went to the passport office every day to try and get his passport. One day he got to the counter just before closing time. He was told, "You're too late, we're closing." He cajoled the passport clerk, who pointed to the cupboard behind him that was chock full of passports, and said to my father, "If you can find your passport in the next 5 minutes, you can have it." But fortunately for my father, another passport clerk had come across his passport, this very one, that day. And because my father had been coming daily, this passport clerk remembered him and had put his passport aside. He overheard the exchange between my father and his colleague, and he handed my father his passport. And on the way out, my father passed his youngest brother, Egon Schonfeld, in the queue, who was also hoping to get his passport. Well, Egon never got his passport. And that was the last time my father ever saw him, because Evan was murdered in a subcamp of Auschwitz. So my father really did get out by the skin of his teeth. Now, Relly's family also, her parents decided, once the Germans had invaded the Sudetenland, this is before the outbreak of war, they decided to leave Jestebnik as well and move further west, away from the eastern border. If you remember, it was very close to the Polish border. And this is really describing her parents leaving Jestebnik. And I'd just like you to take note about what she says about the young German men at the end of this little clip.
They came in October 38, when my parents left Jestebnik and moved to Walachisch Meserich. There was a niece of my mother, and she invited them to be in Walachisch Meserich. So when that happened, my parents got a big truck and took the furniture and a lot of groceries too from the shop. And you know, all the German neighbors, the young men with the swastikas already helped my parents And they even wanted them to stay that they will guard them and protect them, but parents knew better and left.
So I find this this raises the issue or the question that is so often asked about the Holocaust. You know, how and why do people who've got on very well, lived around each other, suddenly become enemies with one, you know, becoming the murderers of the other or implicit in their murder? What happens to change people like that? And in this way, and the way Relly described, she said that the families, so you can imagine that there were German families around there that getting on very well with Relly's parents, liked Relly's family, and the young men at that time, we're talking, you know, 1938, they thought they were being patriotic wearing the swastika. And I really don't think they would have had, who knows whether their parents supported Hitler, I don't know. But these young men were seized by that kind of fever of what they thought was patriotism, but really is lethal nationalism, and hadn't quite worked out the difference yet, hadn't quite, I think anyway, you know, that actually they were talking about real people here. It's probably much more of an ideology to them still at that time, hateful though it was. I don't think they connected. And then this is another example of how people change. Remember I said Relly was having singing lessons in Moravska Ostrava, and she's describing now her singing teacher. At the beginning of the clip, when she says I'd stop taking lessons, what she means is she'd stop taking singing lessons.
Did you feel insecure because of the events in Germany?
No, not at the time. Not at the time. And I married them in 1937.
Right.
I stopped going to lessons.
Yes.
And I heard when Hitler came then to Ostrava, how our choir master and my teacher turned to be a very nasty Nazi.
Right. What year?
It was 38.
38.
Yes. He didn't want to speak to Jews, whom he knew very well. He had a friend, Professor Braun,
Yes.
that was a very good friend of his.
Yes.
And in the first or second week, when the Germans were in Ostrava, they took Professor Braun to the Gestapo. And his daughter came to beg him to help her father. He threw her out. He didn't want to speak to Jews. So we knew then what person he was.
Yeah, again, you know, she'd been in his choir. He knew them suddenly like that. It didn't take very much to turn into, like she said, he turned out to be a very nasty Nazi. Relly at this time was still in Moravska Ostrava with Moritz. Moritz was working still at the hospital in Vitkovice that I showed you before. Right. But to be expected, Hitler did not keep his word, and he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. And these are German troops invading Prague. And now began the serious persecution and violence against Jews. Here's a picture of a synagogue in Czechoslovakia with the graffiti, the swastika, picture of a Jew being hanged. In Ostrava, there'd been 6 synagogues, and within 3 months, they had all been destroyed. So things really were happening very, very rapidly. And I think it was early 1941, people were forced to wear the yellow star. So, as I said, Relly's family decided to move further away from the border to a town called Velasquez Mezerici, where Relly had a cousin who'd offered had a house and offered for her parents to come and stay. Like I say, Moritz was still working as a doctor in Ostrava, before or after the invasion of the Sudetenland. When the Germans invaded the rest of the country, the first thing they did, on the first day, they announced that Jewish doctors were no longer allowed to practice. So, but they had to keep Moritz on in the hospital in Witkowice to train up the German doctors. So they stayed on for a few more months. Then Moritz got a job at the Jewish hospital in Prague. And for some reason, I'm not sure whether there's any definite proof or reason about why the Germans did this. They left some of Prague alone. They left the Jewish hospital alone. They left the synagogues alone. And Moritz was able to go and work in the hospital in Prague. However, the Gestapo would not allow Relly to go and visit him. They said she could go once a year. Well, they'd only been married for probably less than 2 years at this point. She was still very young, 23, 24. So that wasn't going to do. And Moritz unofficially left the hospital in Prague to join her. And then they joined their parents in Velasquez Mezerici in this house, which is still there. And that's what it looks like now. And if you go out the front door and look left, that's the road. Of course, you wouldn't have these lorries and things. They lived there. What did they do? They weren't allowed to work. They lived on savings. Relly said they went for bicycle rides. They went for walks. They tried to have some sort of life. Moritz was a very good painter as well. And he spent some of his time painting. Now, only one of his paintings survived. And it's this one, which Relly bequeathed to me in her will, and it now hangs on my wall. You can see he was very gifted. This is a pastel copy of the Murillo picture, Children Playing with Dice. One day, the Gestapo paid them a visit because they'd heard Moritz was painting, and they wanted to make sure he was not painting what they called degenerate art. And they stayed a while going through all his art books, because, of course, as I'm sure all of you know, the Nazis called anything that they didn't like degenerate art, but they certainly knew its value, and they stole many masterpieces themselves. So they tried to have some kind of life. I mean, how they did it is beyond me still, with those kind of threats, because, sorry, that's Velasquez Mezerici again, the town. There was fighting, there was a resistance movement going on, trying, against the Nazis. And in fact, the house in which they stayed belonged to Relly's cousin. She supported financially the resistance. She was rumbled. She was sent to Dachau, from where she was forced to work in a salt mine barefoot. She contracted gangrene. She had to have her legs amputated. Her husband appealed to the Gestapo to be able to go and visit her. And so they sent him to Dachau, and then both of them to Auschwitz as well. But, very, very brave people fighting in the resistance, because the consequences were horrendous if you were caught. And in 1941, anti-Jewish laws were introduced into Czechoslovakia. These had begun in Germany in 1933. There were 2,000 anti-Jewish laws and regulations altogether. And in Germany, they had started them gradually because they didn't want the general population to realize the extent of their anti-Semitism at first. But by the time they were in Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia got them all at once, more or less. And you could see anything. These are just a few of the 2,000 laws, anything to dehumanize them. They couldn't go to parks, swimming pools, restaurants. They had a curfew, no radios. I remember Relly said the radios were taken away. They came and took Relly's jewelry while she was there as well. And then in 1942, in June, Reinhard Heydrich, who was Hitler's top man in Czechoslovakia, Hitler's Reich protector, he was assassinated by the Czechoslovakian resistance. And the repercussions for this were horrendous. For example, some of you might have heard of Lidice, and they picked a village and they rounded up everyone and every living thing, animals as well, and they just slaughtered everybody. They murdered 3,000 Slavs altogether in retaliation at the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. And then the deportations in October began from Velasquez Mezerici. This is a picture of a deportation. There is now a memorial in Velasquez Mezerici for the Jews, the murdered Jews of that town. And Moritz's name is on it. Relly's isn't because she survived, but Moritz's name is on it, and Relly's cousin Anna, the one who helped the Czech resistance as well. And they were sent hundreds, couple of hundred kilometers away to Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt is really worth a whole talk on its own. So I will try and be brief. And if you have any more questions at the end, please ask at the end, although I'm probably going to be telling you some things that most of you already know. Theresienstadt was a fortress town, a former fortress town comprising barracks and residential houses, which Hitler designated as a kind of ghetto, concentration camp, transit camp. It wasn't an extermination camp. They didn't have gas chambers, but 33,000 people died in Theresienstadt during the war. And it was barracks. It was used for propaganda purposes as well, which some of you probably know about, how they fooled a Red Cross delegation. There's not time to go into that now, but there were people lining up for food. And Relly did say that she worked in Theresienstadt. She was there, she and Moritz were there for 2.5 years. So she would have been, she must have been 25 at this time. Yes, I think 25 she would have been when she went into Theresienstadt, maybe 26, 27, sorry. But I think she must have done this kind of work. I never asked her specifically what she did. And Moritz worked as a doctor for 2.5 years there. And here is Relly describing what Theresienstadt was like. Now this, again, those are the barracks. And here's a picture, an artist's impression, because many artists went to Theresienstadt, and there are thousands of drawings that were made there. And this is Relly describing now what it was like.
Did the camp look like?
In front, when you walked through the streets, it looked quite good. It was not so bad, but when you came in a house, there were in the barracks, not barracks, that were private homes. There were private homes too, and a lot of people lived in private homes. There were 10 in one room, for instance. A lot of privacy they didn't have, but they didn't live in barracks. And when you came in such a house, the smell was people, sick people who were dying and lying on the floor, or dead people, and then the people came with a car and took them away. It was not a very nice sight.
Yes, quite an understatement, that. So here's that picture again, an artist's impressions of Theresienstadt. And I've picked a few more artist impressions. I think they are very powerful. And this is one, I know it's not a very good reproduction of it. I don't know whether you can make it out, but this is, these are the commandant's wives. I mean, the Germans and the SS who ran the camp lived a life of luxury, really. They had their own cinema. They had a really nice time. And here are some of that commandant's wives, leading a life of leisure and luxury, sort of cheek by jowl, right next to suffering and death. And again, that's sort of, I think for all of us watching, and most people, it's incomprehensible how that's possible. This is an artist's depiction of the crowded conditions in Theresienstadt. And the threat of death was always present. Like I say, there were 33,000 deaths in Theresienstadt altogether, and there were executions as well. Relly and Moritz escaped not escape. They managed to avoid the first transport they were scheduled to go on, because they were waiting to get onto the train, and suddenly an announcement came through asking for Dr. Schonfeld for some medical emergency. And so Relly had some protection being a doctor's wife, and so they went back and escaped that transport. And then this, I think this is a really interesting photograph, you know, of doctors. This is how Moritz worked. There were several stories Relly was able to tell me. There's not time now to tell them, but doctors working in Theresienstadt doing an operation, and notice their concentration camp uniform pajamas underneath their surgical gowns. And then in 1942, October 1944, they were deported on the penultimate transport from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. These are bunks in Auschwitz, the kind that Relly slept on. Now, Relly said when they got to Auschwitz, she and Moritz didn't have a chance to say goodbye. They were just separated right away. She didn't know what had happened to him. She was lucky in a way, because he was, she found out later, killed almost as soon as he entered Auschwitz. He had stood up to Mengele, saying that as a doctor he wouldn't do any manual work, and that Relly found this out from other doctors at the end of the war, but that sealed his fate. Relly was lucky. She slept in these bunks like these for 9 days. She said that when there were 9 of them in a bunk, when one of them turned over, they all had to turn over. She became friends with the woman next to whom she slept for 9 days, who fortunately also survived, and they remained lifelong friends. But like I say, Relly didn't know what had happened to Moritz. And luckily for her, after 9 days, the Germans needed slave labor for a munitions factory, and they took 200 women from Auschwitz to Oderan, which was back in Germany, where Relly spent the next 6 months. And this is where she would have spent her 30th birthday. She said the guards were not cruel. They let her sleep. She was exhausted by this time, as you can imagine. And she said the guards let her sleep in a cupboard sometimes. So at least she didn't experience too much cruelty then. And yes, like I say, she had her 30th birthday then. She spent 6 months there. I've not got a picture of that particular munitions factory, but this is a picture of forced labor, slave labor in a German munitions factory. So she went from Theresienstadt to Oderan, and the reason I've got the arrow going back to Theresienstadt is because towards the end of the war, the Germans didn't know what to do with many prisoners, and in a way, Relly was quite lucky. They took the 200 women that they'd taken from Auschwitz, they put them on a train. It was a coal train. And no, that was the one arriving to Oderan, sorry. They put them on a cattle truck again back to Theresienstadt, where Relly arrived at the liberation. So this is Relly's journey bit by bit. So she went from Ostrava or Velasquez Mezerici to Theresienstadt. That was in a cattle truck. That was 365 kilometers. From Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, 450 kilometers in a cattle truck. She said they were told they were going to Germany to work in a concentration camp. They still didn't know about the extermination camps, and they didn't know they were going to Poland. That was 450 kilometers in a cattle truck. 600 kilometers to Oderan. That was in a coal truck. She said they were black head to foot when they arrived in Oderan. They're covered in coal. And then 150 kilometers back to Theresienstadt, where they arrived as the camp was being liberated. They were let out of their train. Their German guards fled. Relly said they all ran into the camp. Well, for those who could run, ran into the camp. Everyone was hugging each other, apart from those who went after the guards. Some did go after the guards, understandably, because of course the condition. The Nazis had a policy of forced starvation, and there was many people in this condition, and there was a cholera breakout as well after the liberation. So back to a lovely picture of Relly again, wonderful woman, extraordinary woman, really warm, not bitter, welcomed me as her long lost niece with open arms, she and her family. I was very, very lucky. I would never have known any of this, and I wouldn't have known that my father was Jewish if I hadn't traced Relly. And that's why I've written a book, really. That's my story about tracing Relly. And it's also an attempt to help give the Holocaust contemporary relevance. Because for many of us, that, you know, I'm still looking for information about what happened to my father's family. But this is Relly. After the war, she remarried Carl. They moved to Israel. They had a son, Peter. Carl suffered ill health because he'd suffered in the war. He had to eat grass to survive. They left Israel in the 60s. They went to Australia, where Relly opened a milk bar, and she ran that until she retired. Of course, all her experience with the family shop would have helped. This is a picture she sent me when I finally traced her in 1998. This is Relly with her son, Peter, daughter-in-law, Evelyn, and her two grandchildren, Ilana and Daniel, and I'm still very good friends with them, and they welcomed me with open arms as well. That's a picture of me on one of my visits with Relly. I can't believe how lucky I was to have had her in my life. She was an extraordinary woman. One more picture, my grandmother. Now, when I say about wanting to keep the Holocaust a contemporary issue, for a lot of us, it's still very up close and personal. This is my grandmother who died in Theresienstadt. I never saw this picture. I'd never seen any pictures of my father's family until that wedding photograph of Moritz and Relly. This photograph was sent to me in 2018. That's not long ago. First time I'd seen a picture of my grandmother, probably on her arrival in Theresienstadt, I think, not as she was about to leave to, be transported to Treblinka. 2018. It's not long ago. I don't know. I have no official records of where my other uncle Egan ended up, where my grandfather ended up. Many of us as the second generation are still trying to uncover information. So it's still sort of up close and personal, really, to us. Another reason for wanting to give these talks and talk about this, my father's family, is to hopefully sort of help prevent or contribute towards helping prevent similar things happening again. And I just want to go back to this kind of propaganda that was in the 1930s in this country. And I'm sure many of you, like me, were very alarmed recently in this country to see headlines like this, relentless headlines, just whipping up xenophobia against migrants, lies, propaganda, relentless. I found that extremely alarming. And there is Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, who says, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. So this is how it all starts. And another thing, this is what I show school children as well, which I think is important. The banality of evil. The quote by the famous German philosopher Hannah Arendt. In other words, evil does not necessarily look anything out of the ordinary at all. The Nazis were not monsters, they were people behaving like monsters. And if you looked at them all here, there's Hitler being nice to a little child, smiling, having a meal. There's Goebbels. They're all having a nice time. They look totally normal. There's Goebbels and Hitler. And there's Goebbels with his 6 children, whom when at the end of the war, when he realized the Germans had lost, he killed them all. So appearances are deceptive. And I just want to finish now on that picture, that lovely picture of Relly. She really was an extraordinary human being. And I think, well, I'll play one more clip. I know I sort of run slightly over, but this is Relly being asked, or will I? Sorry, my mouse has decided to pack up. So maybe that means we're not going to hear that clip. She's basically saying she hopes young people will not have to go through anything like what she went through when she was young. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and any questions or any comments, please. I think now's the time you can unmute.